I wasn't looking for bloodlines when I started this. I was following a simpler question. If the giants in the photographs were real, and at this point in this investigation I'm convinced they were, then where did their children go? That's all I wanted to know. A biological follow-up, a genealogical thread, the kind of question any responsible investigator asks after establishing that a thing existed, something was photographed, documented, buried, reported in mainstream newspapers, catalogued in institutional archives, then systematically removed from public consciousness. So where is the next generation? I expected silence. I expected dead ends. That's what this investigation delivers most reliably. You pull a thread, you find nothing, not because nothing is there, but because someone made sure the thread leads nowhere. What I didn't expect was what I actually found. Not silence, something worse, evidence hiding in plain sight, in the most visible, most documented, most celebrated families in the Western world. Hiding not because it was removed, hiding because we were trained not to look at it. Let me start with the photographs again. Not the giants themselves this time. Look at who's standing next to them. In the formal portraits from the 1860s and 1870s, the ones I've spent months cataloguing, the individuals of extraordinary stature are almost never photographed alone. They stand with other people, normal-sized people by most definitions. But look closely at those companions, not at their heights, at their proportions, the width of the shoulders, the length of the arms relative to the torso, the size of the hands, the bone structure of the face, the jaw, the orbital ridge. There's a term in physical anthropology, acromegalic features, characteristics associated with abnormal growth hormone production, prominent brow, extended jaw, enlarged hands and feet, broad, deep chest. A physical profile that reads as simply large, simply imposing, simply commanding, until you compare it to the baseline. Now look at the official portraits of 19th century aristocracy. Not the paintings designed for flattery. The photographs. The unposed ones. The early daguerreotypes taken before subjects understood how to perform for a camera. The overlap is not subtle once you see it. I'm not saying the ruling classes of the 1800s were giants. I'm saying something more specific and more disturbing. I'm saying that a measurable percentage of the most powerful individuals in 19th century Europe and America display skeletal and physical features consistent with diluted giant ancestry. Not full expression, not the 9-foot individuals in the formal portraits, but the signature, the echo of something in the bone structure that standard human genetics doesn't fully explain. Here's where the official science becomes interesting. We're told that extreme height and the features associated with it are caused by pituitary abnormalities, random mutations, isolated medical conditions, not heritable, not genetic in any meaningful dynasty-building sense. Just individual accidents of biology that appear, create a brief statistical outlier, and disappear. But that's not what the research shows when you go deeper than the introductory explanation. Studies in growth hormone receptor genetics, conducted primarily in the 1990s and 2000s, identified specific allelic variants associated not with pituitary disorder, but with inherited stature amplification, heritable, expressed differently across generations, sometimes dormant for a generation, sometimes two, then re-emerging in altered form, not a medical anomaly, a genetic lineage, a set of characteristics that can be carried without full expression, passed forward through generations that appear normal by standard measurement, and then surface again under the right conditions. The official explanation for why royal families were often notably taller than the general population is nutrition, better food, better living conditions, no childhood labor, better bone development. And that's true, to a point. But nutrition doesn't explain the specific pattern. It doesn't explain why the height differential is concentrated in particular families across particular centuries. It doesn't explain why certain noble houses produced generation after generation of individuals described in contemporary accounts as physically commanding beyond what their diet alone could account for. It doesn't explain why the specific features I'm describing, the bone structure, the proportions, the jaw, the orbital ridge, the hand size, cluster in ways that track lineage rather than geography, unless the lineage itself carried something. Let me tell you about the deliberate construction of European nobility. This is documented. This isn't speculation. The consolidation of European royal houses in the 17th and 18th centuries was a project of systematic intermarriage between a remarkably small number of families. Habsburg, Romanov, Bourbon, Windsor, then Hanover, Hohenzollern, Braganza. The genealogical trees don't branch, they loop. They cross themselves with a frequency that geneticists have noted produces a coefficient of kinship that would be considered pathological in any other population. They were not just preserving wealth, they were not just consolidating power. When you look at the patterns of which families were permitted to intermarry, which bloodlines were considered acceptable and which were not, the criteria were never purely political. Contemporary accounts, letters, diaries of the nobility themselves describe an obsession with what they called good blood. Not metaphorically, literally, the physical expression of lineage, the body as proof of descent. What were they preserving? And here's the part of this I can't stop thinking about: the timing. The consolidation project peaks in the 1700s and early 1800s. The exact same period that the giant photographs begin to appear and then disappear. The exact same period Tartaria vanishes from the maps. The exact same period that official history describes as the emergence of the modern nation-state, the transfer of power from hereditary aristocracy toward constitutional governance, the apparent dismantling of the old order. Except the old order didn't dismantle, it reorganized. What if the consolidation of the royal houses wasn't political maneuvering? What if it was genetic triage? What if the surviving members of a specialized biological class, the administrative guardians we've discussed in this series, the overseer caste of a civilization we've been taught to forget, were absorbed into European nobility not by coincidence but by design, not as rulers, as carriers? Think about what that would require. You have a population of individuals with distinctive physical characteristics. A civilization collapses or is destroyed. The survivors scatter. Some are killed, some are displaced, some are absorbed by the dominant regional powers. Married in, legitimized, their extraordinary characteristics reframed as evidence of divine favor or noble blood rather than evidence of a different biological heritage. Their height becomes kingly, their bone structure becomes aristocratic, their physical dominance becomes proof of right to rule rather than proof of ancestry. And the bloodline continues, diluted, expressed at lower intensity with each generation of intermarriage with the general population, but tracked, monitored, deliberately concentrated through the marriage policies of a nobility obsessed with what they called purity of descent. Which brings me to the one piece of evidence I've been sitting on for months because I didn't know how to present it without sounding like I'd lost the thread entirely. Height records. Systematic height records for military conscripts begin in Europe in the early 1800s. France, Prussia, Britain, Russia all begin measuring their soldiers in this period, creating for the first time a documented statistical baseline for human stature across large populations. This wasn't done randomly. This was institutional. Official government programs measuring, recording, archiving, creating exactly the kind of paper trail that should, if we use it correctly, tell us something real. What those records show has been discussed in academic literature but never fully investigated for what it implies. The height differential between the aristocratic officer class and the conscript population in early 19th century armies is significant, far beyond what nutrition alone accounts for. But more specifically, the height distribution within those officer classes is not uniform. It clusters. Certain family networks, certain regional noble lines produce men of exceptional stature with a consistency that the standard model of human height variation doesn't explain. These clusters track ancestry, not diet. They follow specific family lines across multiple generations and multiple countries. And when you map them, when you draw the lines between the families producing these physical outliers, the map looks remarkably like a genealogical project, a deliberate concentration, not random variation, not nutritional advantage, pattern. Someone was keeping track. Let me tell you about something called the Almanac de Gotha. Published continuously from 1763 until 1944, this was the definitive registry of European royal and noble houses, not just names and titles, genealogies, complete lineages tracking descent across centuries, who married whom, which children were legitimate, which bloodlines were considered valid for intermarriage, and which were not. For 181 years, one publication served as the authoritative record of who carried what blood. In 1944, at the end of World War II, the publication ceased. The remaining copies were largely destroyed or confiscated. The records were dispersed. The institution that had maintained this registry for nearly 2 centuries simply stopped. Why 1944? Why then? The official answer is the disruption of war. Publishing infrastructure collapsed. The chaos of the collapsing Third Reich made continuation impossible. And all of that is true. But it's worth noting that the Nazi obsession with genealogy and bloodline was not invented by the Nazi Party. It was inherited. The aristocratic project of tracking noble descent, of maintaining what they called the integrity of certain lines, was centuries old before National Socialism formalized it into state ideology and eventually brought the entire structure down with it. And the first thing the Allied powers did when restructuring post-war Europe was eliminate the public genealogical registry that had tracked that project for 181 years. An interesting choice for a project about practical publishing disruption. What was in those records that required elimination? I can't tell you definitively. The surviving copies are in private collections and institutional archives not open to independent researchers. The genealogical data they contain has never been fully analyzed, not publicly, not by any institution with the resources to do the analysis. What we have are fragments, references, citations that lead to collections that are closed to the public and have been since the war ended. What I can tell you is what the project of tracking those bloodlines was designed to protect, not power in the simple political sense, not just wealth and title, something older, something that predated the nations those families ruled. An inheritance that wasn't territorial but biological, a lineage that carried something those families considered worth nearly 2 centuries of documentation and deliberate preservation. And here's the question that organizes everything else in this investigation. If the giants were an administrative caste, if they served a civilizational function rather than simply existing as biological anomalies, if Tartaria, or whatever it actually was, employed these individuals as overseers, guardians, managers of infrastructure that we still don't understand how it was built, then the collapse of that civilization didn't mean the collapse of those bloodlines. It meant their dispersal and their absorption into the families who claimed the empty cities, into the noble houses who inherited the architecture, into the royal lines who reorganized the world after the maps were redrawn and the encyclopedias were rewritten, and the official timeline was constructed. The children of the giants didn't disappear. They were integrated, hidden in plain sight behind titles and dynastic names and official genealogies that tracked something real without ever naming what it was. And the proof of that isn't speculative. It's measurable. It's in the height records sitting in military archives. It's in the physical descriptions of 19th century aristocracy written by their own contemporaries. It's in the obsessive marriage policies of the royal houses. It's in the 181-year project of genealogical documentation that was eliminated the moment the war ended and the old order was finally forced to reorganize into something new. But here's what disturbs me most. The aristocratic project isn't the only place this pattern appears, because in the same decades that the royal houses were consolidating, another institution was emerging across Europe and America: the great foundling hospitals, orphanages funded by noble houses, staffed by institutions close to the ruling families, receiving children of unknown parentage at a scale that the historical record never adequately explains. The numbers don't make sense if you accept the official account. Foundling hospitals in Paris, London, Moscow, Vienna were receiving tens of thousands of children annually in the early 1800s. Children with no documented parents. Children appearing in population centres that had themselves, in many cases, appeared in the historical record without adequate documentation of prior settlement. Where did those children come from? The official explanation is poverty. Unwanted children of the urban poor, the collateral of industrialization and social dislocation. But the founding dates are wrong. Many of these institutions were established before the industrialization that supposedly created the need for them, before the population density that would generate that volume of orphaned children, before the migration patterns that should precede any such concentration of parentless individuals in a single location. And here's the detail I can't move past. A significant number of foundlings in the administrative intake records of these institutions are described in terms of physical development that differs from the general population. Unusual size, unusual strength, unusual rate of physical maturation, logged as observations, never analyzed, never connected, filed away as individual curiosities in institutions processing children at industrial scale. What were they processing? What happens when a displaced population can no longer sustain its biological heritage in organized form? When the families are gone, when the civilization is erased, when the institutional structure that tracked bloodlines is dismantled? The children don't stop being born, they just stop being documented. They enter the general population through whatever channels are available: foundling hospitals, adoption into rural families, integration into communities that have no framework for understanding what they've absorbed. And maybe some of them, the ones whose characteristics were most visible, the ones who couldn't be integrated without notice, were funneled somewhere else, into institutions that could handle them, into networks that could track them, into a project that had every incentive to find exactly what it was looking for. Which brings us back to the photographs. Look at them again. Not the giants, not even their companions. Look at the settings, the formal portrait studios, the official backdrops, the period-appropriate dress. These weren't casual snapshots. These were formal records, official documentation, the kind of photograph you commission when you want something preserved. Who commissioned them? That question has never been asked in the academic literature because the academic literature refuses to take the photographs seriously. They're anomalies, medical curiosities, sideshow performers misidentified. Move on. Nothing to see. But if you take them seriously, if you accept what the grain and the lighting and the shadow angles and the pre-composite technology date range all suggest, then you're left with a different question. Not whether these individuals existed, but why they were being formally documented. Official records, formal photographs, tracking by institutions with the resources to commission professional portraiture for individuals who would otherwise have no reason to sit for a formal photograph, unless they were being catalogued. Unless somewhere, in an institution we don't know about, in a registry that preceded and perhaps outlasted the Almanac de Gotha, someone was keeping a record of exactly where these individuals were, who they were connected to, and what they were producing. The photographs aren't evidence of giants as curiosities. They're evidence of giants as subjects of institutional attention. Someone thought their existence was worth documenting. Someone thought their location and their connections were worth preserving in formal photographic record. That's not how you treat an anomaly. That's how you track an asset. I keep returning to one image in particular, not because of the subject, but because of what's in the background. A formal portrait, 1874, location unspecified in the catalogue notation I have access to. A man of extraordinary stature, 8 feet by any reasonable estimate, seated, which makes that estimate conservative. Beside him, standing, a woman of normal height, his wife presumably, based on their positioning and their dress. And on the wall behind them, barely visible at the edge of the frame, a painted crest, too small to identify clearly in reproduction, but clearly there, deliberately included in the composition. Someone had a crest, someone had a family insignia, someone was not a curiosity, not a medical anomaly, not a sideshow attraction. Someone was a person with a documented family identity in a period when family crests meant lineage, meant inheritance, meant belonging to a system that tracked descent. And that person was 8 feet tall, and then the photograph stopped, and the newspaper reports stopped, and the genealogical registry stopped, and the questions stopped, except they didn't stop, they were stopped. The pattern in this investigation has always been the same. Evidence accumulates, reaches a threshold of visibility, and then disappears, not gradually, not through natural decay or simple neglect. Abruptly, systematically, across multiple institutions, multiple countries, multiple categories of evidence, all within the same compressed historical window. The photographs stop appearing after approximately 1900. The skeleton reports stop after approximately 1920. The Almanac de Gotha stops in 1944. The official Tartarian entries disappear from maps between 1820 and 1850. These aren't independent events. They're phases. First, you erase the civilization, then you absorb the survivors. Then you track the bloodlines under institutional cover. Then you dismantle the tracking systems once the integration is complete enough that the biological signature is diluted beyond easy recognition. And finally, you eliminate the questions themselves, not through censorship exactly, through something more elegant, through academic consensus, through the slow construction of a narrative so complete, so self-referential, so thoroughly embedded in every institution that produces knowledge, that the questions simply stop being asked. Not because they've been forbidden, because they've been made to feel unnecessary. I don't have definitive answers. I've said that before in this investigation, and I'll say it again. The evidence is fragmented, distributed across archives that don't communicate with each other, suppressed in ways that are hard to prove precisely because the suppression was done carefully. What I have is the pattern, the obsessive genealogical documentation followed by systematic destruction, the biological inheritance hidden inside dynastic politics, the physical evidence dismissed as medical anomaly when it contradicts the narrative and celebrated as noble bearing when it serves it. The foundling hospitals receiving children at impossible scale in the exact decades when a displaced population would need to be absorbed. The formal photographs commissioned by someone who thought these individuals were worth documenting. Ask yourself why the same physical characteristics read differently depending on who expresses them. Why height in a conscript is an accident of genetics. Why height in a king is evidence of divine right. Why the same bone structure that makes a laborer remarkable makes a nobleman commanding. The framing was always the point, and the framing was designed specifically to prevent you from asking what I'm asking now. What if the bearing we were trained to admire was never aristocratic? What if it was something older? What if the deference we were trained to feel in the presence of certain physical types was not about class at all? What if it was memory, the inherited recognition of something our ancestors knew and we've forgotten? A biological response to a biological reality that no longer has a name because the civilization that gave it context has been erased from the maps and the encyclopedias and the genealogical registries and the photographic archives. The buildings remember, the bone structure remembers. The 181-year genealogical project remembers, even in its destruction, even in the silence it left behind, somewhere in the private archives, in the closed collections, in the genealogies that ended in 1944 rather than continuing into public record. There is an answer to the question I started with. What happened to the children of the giants? They became the aristocracy we were trained to admire. They became the foundlings absorbed into a civilization that had no framework for understanding what it had inherited. They became the physical outliers in military height records that no one thought to analyze as a pattern. They became the people in the formal portraits with crests on the walls behind them. They became the world we inherited, and we were never supposed to notice. If you've seen what I'm describing, if you've looked at the portraits and felt the wrongness in the official explanation, if you've noticed the physical clustering in families the record insists arrived at their stature through nothing more than better nutrition and fortunate genetics, leave a comment. Tell me what you've found. This investigation doesn't end here. It can't end here because the questions accumulate, the patterns compound, and somewhere in the silence between what we're told and what the evidence shows, there is a truth that was hidden in plain sight, not buried, not erased, just reframed, until we forgot how to see it.